The name Dole has appeared on American grocery shelves for more than a century, on pineapple cans, banana stickers, and fruit cups in every supermarket in the country. Most Americans who have reached for that label have never been told what it represents. The Dole family did not merely grow pineapple in Hawaii, they helped overthrow its queen. On the 17th of January, 1893, 162 United States Marines stood in formation while 13 men, most of them the sons and grandsons of American missionaries, declared the Hawaiian monarchy abolished. The man installed as president of the new republic was Sanford Ballard Dole, son of a missionary. His cousin James later bought an entire island. 6 years before the overthrow, the same planter class had ceded a harbor to the United States Navy as the price of keeping American tariffs off their sugar. That harbor was Pearl Harbor. The connection between the pineapple label in American kitchens and the naval base where 2,400 Americans died on the 7th of December, 1941, has never been widely told. It begins with missionaries. The first company of American Protestant missionaries arrived on the western coast of the island of Hawaii in the spring of 1820, having sailed from Boston on the brig Thaddeus. They had been dispatched from Boston by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, 14 men and women who had volunteered to carry the gospel to the Sandwich Islands. Their leader was the Reverend Hiram Bingham, a graduate of Andover Theological Seminary, who arrived with a printing press, a set of hymn books, and the conviction that the Hawaiian people required deliverance from what the missions reports to Boston called the degradation and darkness of heathenism. His colleague, the Reverend Asa Thurston, carried similar certainty. Both men believed their work was spiritual. Neither could have foreseen what their descendants would build on the foundation they were laying. The missionaries found a kingdom in transition. King Kamehameha II had recently abolished the traditional kapo system, and the old religious order was fracturing. The Americans moved into the vacuum. Within a decade, they had established schools, translated the Bible into Hawaiian, and built churches on every major island. Critically, they had also created the first written form of the Hawaiian language and controlled the island's only printing press. The power this conferred was enormous. Every legal document, every treaty, every land record that would be produced in the coming decades would rely on the written instruments the missionaries had designed. They had also become indispensable advisors to the monarchy. The Hawaiian alii, the ruling chiefs, welcomed the missionaries' literacy, their legal knowledge, and their connections to the American government. In return, the missionaries gained access to the highest levels of Hawaiian governance. By the 1830s, missionary advisors were drafting legislation, counseling the king on trade agreements, and shaping the legal framework of the kingdom itself. William Richards, a member of the 1823 Missionary Company, resigned from the mission in 1838 to become the kingdom's teacher, chaplain, and interpreter to King Kamehameha III. He was not the last missionary to discover that statecraft paid better than salvation. The relationship was not one of equals, and the missionaries understood this. They had arrived in a kingdom that lacked Western-style property law, written contracts, and codified commercial regulations. They supplied these instruments. The Hawaiian monarchy adopted them in good faith, believing that modernization would protect the kingdom from the colonial appetites of Britain and France. The missionaries who helped design these protections would eventually be the ones from whom the kingdom needed protection. Their children cemented the transition. In 1841, the Reverend Daniel Dole, father of the future president of the Republic of Hawaii, helped find Punahou School on the outskirts of Honolulu. The school was built explicitly for the sons and daughters of missionaries, a private institution designed to ensure that the next generation would be educated in Hawaii rather than sent back to New England. The students who passed through Punahou in its first decades included the Thurstons, the Castles, the Cooks, the Alexanders, the Baldwins, and the Doles. They learned together, married one another, and entered business together. Samuel Northrop Castle, who had managed the mission's supply depot, and Amos Starr Cook, a former mission teacher, founded Castle and Cook as a mercantile firm in 1851. Samuel Alexander and Henry Baldwin, whose fathers had arrived as missionaries in the early 1830s, acquired land on Maui and began planting sugar. By the 1850s, the sons of the first missionaries were no longer preaching. They were practicing law, managing estates, and advising the monarchy on trade. Several had married into Hawaiian alii families, gaining both social standing and, critically, access to land. The shift was generational, but it was not accidental. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions had always intended its missionaries to be self-sustaining. Stipends were modest. The missionaries were expected to cultivate the land they occupied, to build institutions, to remain. The board did not anticipate that the institutions their missionaries built would outgrow the mission itself. But that is precisely what happened. The schools became networks. The networks became partnerships. The partnerships needed land. And the kingdom, under the persistent counsel of its foreign advisers, was about to make land available on terms it had never before imagined. The generation that arrived to save souls had produced a generation that wanted acres. The mechanism for acquiring them was already being designed in the councils of the king. The mechanism was called the Mahele. For centuries, land in the Hawaiian Islands had not been owned in the Western sense. It had been held. The Ahupua system divided each island into wedge-shaped districts running from the mountain ridges to the sea, each one a self-sustaining unit of forest, stream, taro field, and coastline. The king held ultimate authority over all land, the ali'i administered it, and the maka'ainana, the common people, cultivated it. No one possessed a deed. No one paid a mortgage. The land belonged to the system, and the system belonged to the people who worked it. It had functioned this way for generations before the first missionary stepped ashore. By the 1840s, the foreign advisers surrounding King Kamehameha III had persuaded him that the old system could not survive contact with the outside world. Britain and France had both made territorial claims in the Pacific, and the Americans argued that without Western-style property rights, Hawaii's land was vulnerable to seizure by any colonial power that chose to impose its own legal framework. The solution, they said, was to formalize ownership. Give the king his lands. Give the chiefs their lands. Give the commoners their plots. Write it all down. The argument had a certain logic to it, and it was made by men the king trusted. Several of those men were missionaries or their sons. The Great Mahele was signed in a series of agreements between January and March of 1848. King Kamehameha III divided the kingdom's approximately 4 million acres into 3 categories. Roughly 1 million acres were designated crown lands, reserved for the monarch. Roughly 1.5 million acres became government lands, held in trust for the people. And roughly 1.5 million acres were allocated to the ali'i, the chiefs, who received their portions through individual quit-claim agreements with the king recorded in a set of 4 notebooks that became known as the Mahele Book. Each agreement followed a formula. The chief signed a statement that read, in part, I hereby agree that this division is good. The lands above written are for the king. I have no more rights therein. A system of reciprocal stewardship that had governed the islands for centuries was being dissolved, one signature at a time, in the language of real estate. The commoners received almost nothing. The Kuleana Act of 1850 authorized native tenants to claim fee simple title to the small plots they actually cultivated, but the process required filing a formal claim with the Land Commission, proving continuous cultivation, paying a survey fee, and navigating a legal system conducted largely in English. Thousands of Makai Nana did not file. Many did not understand that they needed to. Others could not afford the fees. When the process concluded, fewer than 10,000 claims had been awarded, covering fewer than 30,000 acres of land. The commoners, who had fed the kingdom for centuries, received less than 1% of its total acreage. The same act that was supposed to protect Hawaiian land opened it to foreign purchase. In 1850, a companion statute permitted non-Hawaiians to buy and hold land in fee, simple for the first time in the kingdom's history. The missionary families and their business associates moved immediately. They had the capital, the legal expertise, and the connections to the chiefs, who were now, for the first time, able to sell. Prime agricultural land on Maui, Oahu, Kauai, and the Big Island began changing hands. The ALII, many of whom were in debt to foreign merchants, sold parcels to cover obligations they had accumulated during the sandalwood and whaling trades. The foreigners who had advised the king to create a market in land became its most aggressive buyers. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. By 1860, foreigners owned more land in the Hawaiian Islands than native Hawaiians held in private title. By 1890, 3/4 of all privately held land belonged to non-Hawaiians. The 30,000 acres awarded to the Makai Nana shrank further as taxes, debt, and unfamiliarity with the mortgage system forced additional sales. A kingdom that had sustained its people through communal stewardship for centuries had been converted, in a single generation, into a real estate market. The largest buyers were the sons and grandsons of the men who had arrived with Bibles and printing presses. They had acquired not merely farms, they had acquired the foundation of an industry. The land they wanted was not for taro or breadfruit. It was flat, well-watered, and positioned in the lowland valleys, where the trade winds carried moisture from the mountains to the coast. It was ideal for sugar. The first commercial sugar plantation in the islands had been established at Koloa on the island of Kauai in 1835, and by the 1850s, sugar was already the most valuable export commodity in the kingdom. But production remained small and fragmented, limited by the cost of shipping raw sugar to distant refineries, and by the American tariff that made Hawaiian sugar more expensive than domestic or Caribbean supply. The missionary families who now held the land understood that their investment would remain modest unless the tariff disappeared. What they needed was not more acreage. They already had that. What they needed was a trade agreement with the United States that would let their sugar enter the American market duty-free. Securing that agreement would require political influence in both Honolulu and Washington. The men who had once counseled the king on scripture were now preparing to counsel him on commerce, and the stakes had grown considerably larger than the size of a congregation. The land was in hand, the crop was chosen. The market was the problem, and the solution was already taking shape 3,000 miles away, in the cotton fields and cane breaks of a nation about to tear itself apart. The American Civil War provided the opening. When Confederate forces cut the Union off from the sugar fields of Louisiana in 1861, the price of raw sugar on the American market doubled. Hawaiian planters, who had been shipping modest quantities to California for years, suddenly found themselves supplying a nation at war. Production surged. New plantations opened on Maui, Oahu, Kauai, and the Big Island. The missionary sons who had acquired land through the Mahele discovered that their acreage, planted in sugar cane and harvested by contract labor, could generate returns that dwarfed anything the mission had ever produced. Between 1860 and 1866, the value of Hawaiian sugar exports to the United States increased more than tenfold. But the war ended, and with it, the emergency demand. Louisiana's sugar industry began rebuilding. The American tariff on foreign sugar, temporarily irrelevant during the conflict, reasserted itself. Hawaiian planters found their product priced out of the only market that mattered. The land was productive, the labor was cheap, and the crop was proven, but the tariff made Hawaiian sugar more expensive than domestic supply. The planters needed the tariff removed, and they were willing to offer the United States something substantial in return. The result was the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875. Signed by King Kalakaua and ratified by the United States Senate, the treaty eliminated American tariffs on Hawaiian sugar, rice, and several other commodities. In exchange, Hawaii agreed not to lease or cede any of its territory to a third power. The effect on the Hawaiian economy was immediate and transformative. Sugar production, which had been roughly 13,000 tons in 1875, reached more than 31,000 tons by 1880. Plantation acreage expanded into upland valleys and coastal plains that had never been cultivated. Capital poured in from San Francisco and New York. The 5 firms that would become the Big Five consolidated their role as the indispensable intermediaries of the sugar trade, providing credit against future harvests, arranging shipping to the California refineries, procuring equipment, and recruiting labor from China, Japan, and the Azores. Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer and Company, Theo H. Davies, and H. Hackfeld and Company each began as modest trading houses or mercantile firms. The treaty transformed them into something closer to investment banks with agricultural portfolios. A planter who needed capital to expand into marginal upland acreage went to one of the 5. A planter who needed 300 Chinese laborers for the harvest went to one of the 5. A planter who needed his raw sugar shipped to the refinery in San Francisco went to one of the 5. The agencies did not merely service the plantations, they owned shares in them, sat on their boards, and by the 1880s had begun absorbing the smaller, independent operations that could not survive without their credit lines. A government report from the period observed that the relationship between planter and agent had become one in which the agent has come to be the dominating factor, and the planter is often little more than a superintendent on his own estate. The scale of what the treaty unleashed deserves attention. In the decade before reciprocity, Hawaii exported sugar worth approximately $1.5 million per year. In the decade after, annual exports exceeded $8 million. The number of operating plantations nearly doubled. The acreage under cane cultivation tripled. The population of the islands shifted as thousands of contract laborers arrived from Asia and the Atlantic to work fields that native Hawaiians increasingly did not own. By 1884, sugar accounted for more than 3/4 of the kingdom's total export revenue. The islands had become, in economic terms, a single crop colony of the American market, except that no flag had been raised and no territory had been formally claimed. The native Hawaiian population, devastated by introduced diseases and increasingly landless, fell below 50,000. The foreign and immigrant population rose past it. The kingdom's own people were becoming a minority in their own country, and the men who controlled the sugar crop controlled the reason. That arrangement held for 12 years. When the treaty came up for renewal in 1887, the terms changed. American politicians, skeptical of a deal they believed disproportionately benefited Hawaiian planters, demanded compensation. The price they named was Pearl Harbor. The amendment to the renewed treaty granted the United States exclusive rights to enter and establish a coaling and repair station at the harbor on the southern coast of Oahu, a deep-water lagoon that American naval strategists had identified as the most valuable anchorage in the Central Pacific. King Kalakaua, already under pressure from the planter class, accepted the cession. The planters supported it. Pearl Harbor was, to them, a manageable concession, a harbor traded for a tariff, sovereignty exchanged in increments for the continued profitability of sugar. The transaction occurred in the same year, and under the same political pressures, as an event that would prove far more consequential for the kingdom. The men who had lobbied for the Pearl Harbor cession were the same men who, on the 30th of June, 1887, would march on Iolani Palace with an armed militia and force the king to sign a new constitution at the point of a bayonet. The harbor and the constitution were not separate events. They were two instruments of the same seizure, one directed at the kingdom's territory and the other at its governance, both engineered by the planter class that had grown rich under the treaty the king had signed in good faith 12 years earlier. The leader of that seizure was a man whose grandfather had sailed into Kailua Bay in the spring of 1820 with a Bible and a printing press. His name was Loren Andrews Thurston. Loren Andrews Thurston was born in Honolulu in 1858. 38 years after his grandfather, the Reverend Asa Thurston, had stepped off the brig Thaddeus at Kailua Bay carrying a Bible and a commission from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. The grandson did not carry a Bible. He carried a law degree, a seat in the Hawaiian legislature, and an absolute conviction that the Hawaiian monarchy was an obstacle to the commercial future his family had spent 2 generations building. He was, by all contemporary accounts, a formidable debater, a relentless organizer, and a man who understood that the difference between influence and power was the willingness to use force. In 1887, Thurston organized the Hawaiian League. It was a secret society, modeled loosely on the committees of correspondence that had preceded the American Revolution, and its membership was drawn from the planter class, the legal profession, and the merchant community of Honolulu. Membership probably never exceeded 400. The native Hawaiian population of the kingdom at the time was approximately 40,000. The League's stated purpose was the establishment of constitutional representative government. Its actual purpose was the transfer of political power from the Hawaiian monarchy to the men who controlled the sugar trade. Thurston drafted its bylaws, recruited its members, and connected it to the Honolulu Rifles, a militia company composed largely of foreign-born residents who had armed themselves during an earlier period of political unrest and never disarmed. The trigger came in the summer of 1887. King Kalakaua, whose spending habits and personal scandals had provided the League with its public justification, was accused of involvement in a bribery scheme involving opium licenses. The accusation may or may not have been well-founded. It did not matter. The League had been waiting for a pretext, and Thurston moved with the precision of a man who had prepared his instruments in advance. On the 30th of June, 1887, the Honolulu Rifles mustered in the streets of Honolulu. Armed members of the Hawaiian League gathered at a public meeting and issued demands. Prime Minister Walter Murray Gibson, the king's closest political ally, was arrested, dragged through the streets, and nearly hanged before being exiled to San Francisco. The League presented Kalakaua with a new cabinet composed entirely of its own members and informed him that he would sign a new constitution. The king argued. He protested. He summoned the American, British, French, Portuguese, and Japanese diplomatic representatives and requested help. Every one of them advised him to comply with the demands. As one of the new cabinet ministers later noted, little was left to the imagination of the hesitating and unwilling sovereign as to what he might expect in the event of his refusal. Kalakaua signed. The document became known as the Bayonet Constitution, and its provisions dismantled the monarchy in everything but name. The king lost the power to dismiss cabinet ministers, to appoint members of the upper house, and to act without cabinet approval on any matter of governance. The vote was restricted to male residents who met a property qualification, which excluded the vast majority of native Hawaiians. Asian residents, including the Chinese and Japanese laborers who had been legally voting under the previous constitution, were stripped of suffrage entirely. Foreign residents who were not naturalized citizens of Hawaii, but who met the property threshold, were granted the vote. The effect was surgical. The electorate was reconstructed to ensure that the planter class and its allies would control the legislature, and, through the legislature, the kingdom. Thurston himself became Minister of the Interior, the position with the broadest operational authority in the new government. He oversaw public lands, water rights, immigration, and the administration of the plantation labor system. Every decision about which laborers entered the kingdom, which lands were leased, and which water was diverted to which plantation now passed through the office of a man whose family had arrived as guests of the Hawaiian crown. The grandson of a missionary sat at the center of the apparatus that governed every acre of sugar land in the islands. His grandfather had come to Hawaii to preach. Lauren Thurston had come to something else entirely, and the Constitution he had written at gunpoint was the instrument that made it permanent. The consequences were immediate and measurable. In the first election held under the Bayonet Constitution, the Reform Party, the political arm of the planter class, swept the legislature. Native Hawaiian representatives, who had held a majority in the previous government, were reduced to a handful. Petitions protesting the new constitution circulated across the islands, gathering thousands of signatures. In 1889, a native Hawaiian named Robert Wilcox led an armed attempt to overthrow the Bayonet Constitution and restore the king's authority. The rebellion failed. 7 of Wilcox's men were killed in the fighting near Iolani Palace, and the planter-controlled courts acquitted him only because a native Hawaiian jury refused to convict. The Constitution stood. The king remained a figurehead, and the planter class governed without serious challenge for the remainder of Kalakaua's reign. Kalakaua lived 4 more years under the Constitution that bore no trace of his consent. He traveled to San Francisco in late 1890, suffering from kidney disease, and died at the Palace Hotel on the 20th of January, 1891. He was 54 years old. The news reached Honolulu by telegraph. His sister, Liliuokalani, inherited a throne that her brother's captors had already emptied of authority. She understood what had been taken. She intended to take it back. Liliuokalani was 52 years old when she ascended to the throne on the 29th of January, 1891. She was an accomplished composer, a published author, and, unlike the figurehead her brother had become, a woman who believed that the Hawaiian monarchy still possessed the moral authority to govern. She had watched the Bayonet Constitution strip the crown of its powers. She had watched the planter class install itself in the legislature and the cabinet. She had watched the foreign population swell while the native Hawaiian population continued to decline. And she had concluded, with a clarity that her opponents would interpret as recklessness, that the Constitution imposed at gunpoint in 1887 was illegitimate and that the Hawaiian people deserved a new one. In January of 1893, Liliuokalani informed her cabinet that she intended to promulgate a new constitution. The document would restore the monarch's executive authority extend the vote to native Hawaiians who had been disenfranchised by the property qualification, and revoke the voting rights of non-citizen foreign residents. It was, in substance, an attempt to reverse the Bayonet Constitution and return governance to the Hawaiian people. Her own cabinet, divided and fearful, refused to sign it. The Queen was forced to announce publicly that she would defer the new constitution to a future date. The deferral did not matter. Lauren Thurston had already been preparing for this moment. Within hours of the Queen's announcement, he convened the Committee of Safety, a group of 13 men drawn from the same network that had engineered the Bayonet Constitution 6 years earlier. The membership was a directory of the missionary planter establishment. Thurston was the organizer. Henry Cooper, an American lawyer, drafted the proclamation. Sanford Dole was approached to lead the provisional government. The remaining members were sugar agents, attorneys, and merchants, nearly all of them the sons or grandsons of American missionaries, or the business partners of men who had. What followed was not a revolution. It was a corporate action with a military escort. On the 14th of January, 1893, United States Minister John L. Stevens, a known annexationist who had been communicating privately with Thurston for months, requested that 162 Marines and sailors from the USS Boston be landed at Honolulu Harbor. The stated justification was the protection of American lives and property. No American life or property was under threat. The troops took up positions between the palace and the government building, their presence a visible declaration that the United States military stood between the Queen and any attempt to resist. On the 17th of January, the Committee of Safety walked to the government building. The building was nearly deserted. The police officers who had been assigned to watch the committee had been drawn away by a gunshot in the street, and in the confusion, the 13 men entered unnoticed. A proclamation was read from the steps, declaring the monarchy abolished and establishing a provisional government. Few people heard it. Minister Stevens immediately recognized the new government before the Queen had even been informed. The numbers tell the scale of what was taken and by how few. 13 men on the committee, roughly 200 armed supporters in the Honolulu Rifles militia, 162 American military personnel on Hawaiian soil. Against them stood a kingdom of approximately 40,000 native Hawaiians, a queen with a standing royal guard of between 300 and 350 soldiers, and a police force that had been deliberately drawn away. The overthrow was accomplished without a single combat death. It was accomplished because the Queen made a calculation that resistance against the Marines would produce a massacre, and she was almost certainly correct. Liliuokalani yielded, but the language of her protest was as precise as any legal brief the committee's attorneys had ever drafted. She addressed her surrender not to the men who had declared her government abolished, but to the superior force of the United States of America, stating that she yielded until such time as the government of the United States shall, upon the facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. She did not recognize the Committee of Safety. She did not acknowledge the provisional government. She placed the burden of restoration on the American government itself, and in doing so, she created a legal and diplomatic argument that would outlive everyone in the room. President Grover Cleveland received the news and responded with something the committee had not anticipated. He ordered an investigation. His envoy, James Henderson Blount, arrived in Honolulu, lowered the American flag that Stevens had raised over the government building, and conducted interviews across the islands. Blount's report concluded that the overthrow was illegal, that Minister Stevens had conspired with the committee, and that the American military presence had been decisive. Cleveland delivered a message to Congress calling the overthrow an act of war committed by a diplomatic representative of the United States, against a feeble but friendly and confiding people. He demanded that Dole resign and restore the Queen. Sanford Ballard Dole, born on the grounds of Punahou School, educated at Williams College in Massachusetts, and installed as president of a government that existed because American Marines had stood in the streets of Honolulu, refused. He told the President of the United States that the internal affairs of Hawaii were no longer his concern. Cleveland could not act without Congress, and Congress would not act. The Queen remained deposed. The provisional government remained in place, and the men who had overthrown a kingdom prepared to make the arrangement permanent. They declared the Republic of Hawaii on the 4th of July, 1894. The date was not accidental. Sanford Dole, now president of a government recognized by every major foreign power except the one that had investigated its origins, stood on the steps of Iolani Palace and proclaimed a new nation under a new constitution. The ceremony borrowed its symbolism from the American founding, as though what had taken place in Honolulu were an act of liberation rather than a seizure. The Queen watched from Washington Place, her private residence a short walk from the palace that had been her seat of government. She was permitted to remain free for the moment. That changed in January of 1895. Robert Wilcox, the same man who had led the failed counter-revolution of 1889, organized a second attempt. A small force of native Hawaiian loyalists and foreign sympathizers gathered arms and attempted to overthrow the Republic. The rebellion was quickly suppressed. Several of the rebels were killed, and in the aftermath, a cache of weapons was discovered on the grounds of Washington Place. Whether the arms had been placed there by the Queen's supporters or by agents of the Republic seeking a pretext has never been conclusively established. It did not need to be. The Republic arrested Liliuokalani, confined her to a single room on the upper floor of Iolani Palace, and held her there for nearly 8 months. She was denied visitors for the first weeks. A guard stood outside her door at all hours. During those months of confinement in the palace that had been the seat of her own government, the Queen composed songs and began writing the memoir that would later be published as Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. During her confinement, the Queen was presented with a document of abdication. She was told that signing it would spare the lives of the loyalists who had been captured in the rebellion. She signed. The document renounced her claim to the throne and pledged her allegiance to the Republic. She later wrote that she had acted under duress, and that the Republic of Hawaii had by force and threats compelled me to yield my authority and to acknowledge their usurpation. The Queen, who had surrendered to the superior force of the United States, now surrendered a second time to the men the United States had failed to remove. With the monarchy formally dissolved and its last sovereign under house arrest, the Republic moved to make annexation inevitable. In 1897, President William McKinley, who did not share his predecessor's reservations about the overthrow, submitted an annexation treaty to the United States Senate. Ratification required a 2/3 vote. The treaty's supporters were confident. They had not accounted for the Hawaiian people. In the fall of 1897, the Hui Aloha Aina, the Hawaiian Patriotic League, launched a petition drive against annexation. Members traveled by horseback, by boat, and on foot across every inhabited island in the chain, carrying petition rolls from village to village, from ranch to ranch, from fishing camp to coastal settlement. In a single week, they gathered 21,269 signatures. The total native Hawaiian population at the time was approximately 40,000. More than half of the native adult population of the kingdom had signed a formal protest against the absorption of their country by the United States. The petitions were carried to Washington by 4 delegates of the Hui Aloha Aina and presented to the Senate. The senators who read them would have seen page after page of signatures, many written in Hawaiian, some by hands more accustomed to field work than to pen and ink, each one a formal declaration of opposition in the name of a kingdom that the signers still considered sovereign. Their effect was decisive. The annexation treaty failed to secure the necessary two-thirds vote. The largest democratic expression in Hawaiian history had stopped the government of the United States from acquiring a sovereign nation through constitutional process. McKinley found another way. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provided the strategic justification. American forces needed coaling stations and naval facilities in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor, already ceded under the 1887 treaty amendment, became militarily essential. On the 7th of July, 1898, McKinley signed the Newlands Resolution, annexing Hawaii by joint resolution of Congress, a mechanism that required only a simple majority in both chambers. No treaty, no two-thirds vote, no plebiscite in Hawaii, no native Hawaiian was asked to consent. The same legislative procedure used to name a post office was used to absorb a nation. Approximately 1.8 million acres of crown and government lands, the lands that had been set aside for the Hawaiian monarchy and the Hawaiian people in the Great Mahele of 1848, transferred to the United States. The provisional government that had been established by 13 men, with the backing of 162 Marines, had become a territory of the United States of America. The 5 corporations that had engineered the overthrow now operated under the American flag, subject to American commercial law, with access to the American labor market and the American tariff schedule. Every obstacle had been removed. The Queen lived the remainder of her life at Washington Place, composing music, writing her memoir, and petitioning the United States government for the return of the Crown lands. She died on the 11th of November, 1917, at the age of 79. The lands were not returned. The 21,269 signatures of the KIUE petitions were filed in a box at the National Archives in Washington, where they sat, unexamined, for almost exactly 100 years. With the monarchy abolished, the Queen imprisoned, and the islands annexed, the 5 corporations that had engineered the transfer operated without constraint for the first time. The territorial government was theirs, the land was theirs, the labor supply, the shipping lanes, the banks, the courts, and the Republican Party apparatus that controlled the territorial legislature were theirs. What the Big Five built in the first 3 decades of the 20th century was not merely an industry. It was a closed system, a vertical monopoly so thorough that a government study published in 1905 could state without exaggeration that directly or indirectly, all individuals in the territory of Hawaii are ultimately dependent upon the sugar industry. The social, the economic, and the political structure of the islands alike are built upon a foundation of sugar. The architecture of that monopoly was precise. Castle and Cook, Alexander and Baldwin, C. Brewer and Company, American Factors, and Theo H. Davies operated as factoring agents for 36 of the 38 major sugar plantations in the territory. A planter who needed credit, equipment, shipping, insurance, or labor recruitment went to one of the 5. A planter who needed his raw sugar refined went to the California and Hawaiian Sugar Company, whose refinery on San Francisco Bay was the largest sugar refinery in the world. The refinery was wholly owned by the Big Five. 29 firms producing 7 of every 8 tons of sugar exported from the islands processed their product through that single facility. The entire supply chain, from the cane field on Maui to the sugar bowl on a kitchen table in Ohio, passed through a bottleneck controlled by 5 interlocking corporations. The reach extended beyond sugar. The Big Five controlled Matson Navigation Company, the dominant shipping line between Hawaii and the mainland, which meant they controlled what came into the territory and what left it. They controlled the two largest banks in the islands, the institutions that would eventually become First Hawaiian Bank and Bank of Hawaii. They controlled the major insurance firms, the leading wholesale and retail operations, and the public utilities. In 1937, Edward Walker, the High Sheriff of Hawaii, testified that everything that comes into the territory comes through a large corporation. The independent businessman who attempts to enter business here immediately finds that even nationally advertised lines from the mainland are tied up by the Big Five. He added, with the flatness of a man describing the weather, "It is almost impossible to get an independent line of business as they have everything, lumber, paint, right down the line." The political dimension was equally total. The Republican Party controlled the territorial legislature without interruption from annexation through the 1940s. Big Five officers and directors served as territorial governors, legislators, and judges. The appointments were not secret. They were structural. A Castle or a Cook or a Baldwin on the board of a sugar agency was also, frequently, a Castle or a Cook or a Baldwin in the Territorial Senate or on the board of the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association. The intermarriage network reinforced the structure. The founding families had been marrying one another since the Punahou school years of the 1850s, and by the 20th century, the genealogies of the Big Five were so entangled that a single board meeting could contain 3 generations of the same extended family seated around the same table. The effect was a territory that functioned, in all practical respects, like a company town scaled to the size of an archipelago. The company owned the land. The company owned the houses. The company owned the store. The company employed the police and appointed the judges. The only difference between Hawaii and a coal town in West Virginia was the number of islands and the temperature. The men who ran this system did not see it as exploitation. They saw it as order. They had built the infrastructure, financed the plantations, and created the market. The laborers who worked the fields were, in their view, beneficiaries of a system that provided housing, medical care, and employment in a territory that had no other significant industry. That the housing was segregated, the medical care was minimal, the wages were a fraction of mainland standards, and the workers were imported from countries where the alternatives were worse, did not trouble the men who signed the contracts. The system worked. The sugar shipped. The dividends arrived. But the system depended on one thing above all others, and that was the labor of the men and women who cut the cane, hauled it to the mills, and loaded it onto the ships. Those workers had been arriving in the islands for half a century, recruited from a dozen countries, housed in segregated camps, and identified not by their names, but by numbered brass tags hung around their necks. The tags were called bango. They were small brass discs stamped with a number, and every worker on every plantation in the territory wore one. A man who had traveled 4,000 miles from the Philippines or 6,000 miles from Portugal to work in the cane fields of Hawaii was not, in the eyes of the plantation system, a name. He was a number, recorded in a ledger, assigned to a camp, and tracked by an overseer called a luna, who patrolled the rows on horseback. The bango was the symbol of a labor system designed with the same precision as the sugar refinery. Every component was engineered to produce maximum output at minimum cost, and the most critical component was the workforce itself. The importation began in the 1850s with Chinese contract laborers, recruited to replace the native Hawaiian workers whose population had been devastated by disease and dispossession. When the Chinese workers organized and demanded higher wages, The planters recruited Japanese laborers in large numbers beginning in 1885. When the Japanese organized, the planters brought in Portuguese families from the Azores and Madeira, recruited specifically to serve as a buffer class between the Asian workforce and the white overseers. Koreans arrived after 1903, Puerto Ricans after 1900, and beginning in 1906, Filipino cicada were recruited in waves that would continue for decades, each new group arriving to find that the group before them had been there long enough to understand the conditions and resent them. The strategy was deliberate and documented. The Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, which coordinated labor recruitment across all major plantations, maintained ethnically segregated housing camps. Japanese workers lived in Japanese camps. Filipino workers lived in Filipino camps. Portuguese workers lived in Portuguese camps. The camps were physically separated, and the work gangs were organized by ethnicity. The planters understood that workers who could not speak to one another across camp boundaries could not organize across those boundaries. Division was not an accident of culture. It was a management technique. Life inside the camps followed a pattern that a coal miner in Pennsylvania or a textile worker in a Carolina mill town would have recognized. A labor historian later described the arrangement in terms that applied to every plantation in the territory. The house in which he lives, the store from which he buys, the fields in which he finds his recreation, the hospital in which he is treated, are all owned by the plantation. A worker who complained about wages could be evicted from his housing. A worker who refused an assignment could be denied credit at the company store. A worker who attempted to organize could be blacklisted by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association and find himself unemployable on every plantation in the territory. The system did not require chains, it required dependence, and dependence was built into every wall and every ledger page. The workers organized anyway, and they were destroyed for it. Japanese plantation workers struck in 1909 on Oahu, demanding wages equal to those paid to Portuguese workers for the same labor. The planters evicted the strikers and their families from plantation housing and replaced them with strikebreakers recruited from other ethnic groups. The strike collapsed. In 1920, Japanese and Filipino workers struck together for the first time, a breakthrough in solidarity that the planters met with mass evictions during an influenza epidemic. Thousands of displaced workers and their families crowded into emergency shelters in Honolulu. More than 150 strikers and family members died from the influenza that swept through the cramped conditions of eviction. The bloodiest confrontation came on the island of Kauai. On the 9th of September, 1924, Filipino strikers at the Makaweli plantation near Hanapepe had been camped out for weeks, demanding a $2 daily wage and an 8-hour workday. They were earning approximately $20 a month. When two strikebreakers rode through the camp on bicycles, the strikers seized them. Sheriff William Crowell arrived with a posse of armed deputies. A confrontation erupted on the banks of a small river above the town. When it ended, 16 Filipino workers were dead, many shot by deputized marksmen positioned on a nearby hillside. 4 police officers were also killed. 76 workers were arrested and tried. 60 received 4-year prison sentences. The strike leader, Pablo Manlapit, was imprisoned and then deported on the condition that he never returned to Hawaii. No law enforcement officer was investigated or charged. The 16 dead strikers were buried in a mass grave that was not rediscovered until October of 2019, when a group of amateur historians on Kauai went looking for it. The lesson of Hanapepe and of every strike that preceded it was that ethnic unionism could not defeat the Big Five. Every single nationality strike had been broken by the same method. Replace the strikers with workers from a different country who did not yet know the conditions they were inheriting. The system would hold as long as the workforce remained divided. But running parallel to the sugar empire, a second plantation industry had been growing on another island under the direction of a man whose last name was already famous in Hawaii for reasons that had nothing to do with pineapple. James Drummond Dole arrived in Honolulu on the 16th of November, 1899, 22 years old, carrying savings of $16,240 and freshly minted degrees from Harvard in business and agriculture. He had been born in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts, the son of a Unitarian minister. His father, Charles Fletcher Dole, had hoped James would enter the clergy. James had other plans. His cousin Sanford Ballard Dole was, at that moment, serving as the first governor of the territory of Hawaii, having transitioned smoothly from President of the Republic he had helped create to the chief executive of the American territory it had become. The family name already carried weight in the islands. It was associated, as Sanford would later put it, with religious, educational, and philanthropic enterprises. James intended to add agriculture. He bought 61 acres of red volcanic soil in the upland plateau of Wahiawa on the island of Oahu and planted pineapple. The Honolulu Advertiser called the venture foolish, editorializing that pineapple cultivation had been tried before and was certain to fail again. Dole ignored the paper. By 1901, he had founded the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, known as HAPCO, and built a small cannery near the fields. The pineapple grew, the cans sold, and in 1913, a mechanical invention transformed the enterprise. The Jinaka machine, developed for the Hawaiian pineapple industry, could peel and core 35 pineapples per minute, replacing hundreds of workers who had previously processed each fruit by hand. Production costs fell. Output surged. Hawaiian canned pineapple began appearing in mainland grocery stores at prices that turned an exotic tropical fruit into a household staple. In 1910, Sanford Dole had written his cousin a letter. "The more I think about it," the former governor wrote, "the less I like the proposition of using the Dole name for your enterprise. It is a name which has long been associated in these islands with religious, educational, and philanthropic enterprises. I think it would be regrettable to give it an association of such a commercial character." James honored his cousin's wishes for as long as he controlled the company. The Hawaiian Pineapple Company bore no reference to the Dole name during his tenure. The irony of that restraint would become apparent only later. In 1922, James Dole made the decision that would define both his legacy and the island of Lanai. He purchased nearly the entire island for $1.1 million, approximately $29 million in current value, from the family that had been ranching it for decades. Lanai was the sixth largest island in the Hawaiian chain, 90,000 acres of dry, wind-scoured terrain that most agricultural planners would have dismissed. Dole did not dismiss it. He saw flat upland acreage, reliable trade winds, and a problem he believed he could solve. The problem was water. Lanai received far less rainfall than the other major islands, and its groundwater aquifer was insufficient for large-scale irrigation. Dole's solution was one of the more remarkable feats of agricultural engineering in the Pacific. He planted millions of Cook Island pines across the island's highland ridges. The tall, dense conifers condensed moisture from the fog and trade-wind clouds that swept across the uplands, dripping water into the soil and recharging the aquifer below. Dole did not merely farm the island. He altered its hydrology to make farming possible. Within a decade, the transformation was complete. 20,000 acres of Lanai were under pineapple cultivation. Dole had built Kaumalapau Harbor on the island's western coast to ship the harvest by barge to the cannery on Oahu. He had laid out Lanai City, a planned plantation town with houses, schools, and a community center for more than 1,000 workers and their families. The workforce was imported from the same countries that supplied the sugar plantations. Filipino, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Portuguese, and Puerto Rican laborers arrived on Lanai to find the same system they would have encountered on any sugar estate, with company housing, company stores, and overseers who answered to a single employer who owned everything in sight. The numbers reached their peak in the early 1930s. Lanai produced 75% of the world's pineapple supply. Hawaii as a whole exported more than 9 million cases of canned pineapple per year from 8 canneries. The pineapple industry employed tens of thousands of workers across the territory. Combined with sugar, the two plantation crops had reshaped the demographics of the Hawaiian Islands so thoroughly that by 1930, the population was majority Asian and Pacific Islander, a transformation engineered not by immigration policy, but by labor recruitment. The missionary families who had arrived in a Polynesian kingdom had built an economy that drew its workforce from half the nations of the Pacific Rim. The Depression ended James Dole's control of the enterprise. Hawaiian pineapple prices collapsed along with the American economy, and HAPCO posted staggering losses. The board, on which Dole had never held a controlling interest, forced him out of management in 1932 and gave him the honorary title of chairman. The company was reorganized by Castle and Cook, one of the original Big Five, and it was the new owners who began doing what Sanford had asked James not to do. They put the Dole name on the cans. The brand that would become one of the most recognized food labels in the world was built on a name that its most prominent family member had specifically asked to be kept out of commerce. James Dole died in Honolulu on the 20th of May, 1958, at the age of 80. He held a title with no authority, attached to a company that bore a name he had never intended to give it. The workers who had built both the sugar and pineapple empires were, by then, already organizing in a way that none of the previous strikes had attempted. The union that would finally break the Big Five was not Hawaiian. It came from the docks of San Francisco. The International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union had been organizing on the waterfronts of San Francisco and the Pacific Coast since the mid-1930s. And its leader, Harry Bridges, understood something that every plantation strike in Hawaiian history had failed to grasp. The only way to defeat an employer who divided workers by race was to build a union that refused to be divided. The ILWU came to Hawaii through the docks of Honolulu and Hilo, organizing longshoremen first, then moving inland to the plantations. Its regional director, Jack Hall, recruited from every ethnic group on every island, holding meetings in Japanese, Filipino, Portuguese, and English, building a membership that looked like the workforce it represented rather than like any single country of origin. On the 1st of September, 1946, approximately 26,000 sugar workers walked off their jobs. Their families walked with them. 76,000 people in all, roughly 1/5 of the territory's entire population, began a strike that would last 79 days and shut down 33 of the territory's 34 sugar plantations. 99% of the membership had voted to strike. Virtually none broke the picket line. The workers demanded higher wages, a 40-hour week, and the conversion of plantation perquisites, the company housing, the company medical care, the company fuel, to a cash basis so that the planters could no longer use basic necessities as instruments of control. The Big Five refused to negotiate. the ILWU held. Workers formed committees to govern the striking plantations, grew food in communal gardens, hunted, fished, and organized social activities to sustain morale across nearly 3 months without pay. Meetings were conducted in multiple languages simultaneously, with translators relaying each point to workers from different national backgrounds. The solidarity that the planters had spent half a century engineering against had finally materialized, and it held under conditions designed to break it. On the 17th of November, 1946, the ILWU negotiated the end of the strike. The terms were modest by mainland standards. Wages increased but did not reach the levels the union had demanded. But the structural victory was total. The plantation system's control over its workers' lives, the company house, the company store, the company doctor as instruments of compliance, was broken. A year later, the ILWU organized 20,000 pineapple workers. The movement had spread too far and too wide to contain. The political consequences followed within a decade. The Democratic Party of Hawaii, backed by the ILWU, and the returning veterans of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the decorated Japanese-American unit that had fought in Europe while their families labored on plantations at home, swept the territorial legislature in 1954. The Republican Party that had governed on behalf of the Big Five since annexation lost both chambers for the first time. The Democratic Revolution, as it came to be called, did not dismantle the Big Five, but it ended their unchallenged control of Hawaiian governance. Statehood followed in 1959. Hawaii became the 50th state, and the plantation economy that had built the territory began its long decline. The numbers of that decline are as stark as the numbers of the rise. Sugar production, which had peaked at more than 1 million tons per year, fell steadily as global competition from countries with lower labor costs undercut Hawaiian prices. Plantation after plantation closed. The last sugar harvest in Hawaii was completed in December 2016, ending an industry that had shaped the islands for more than a century and a half. Pineapple followed the same trajectory. Lanai's pineapple operations shut down in 1992, 70 years after James Dole had purchased the island and planted his first crop. The man who closed the pineapple fields on Lanai was David Murdoch, a self-made billionaire who had acquired Castle and Cook, one of the original Big Five, and with it, ownership of the island itself. Murdoch ran Lanai for nearly 3 decades. He oversaw the transition from agriculture to luxury tourism, building 2 resort hotels and a golf course on land that had been pineapple rose. He referred to the island's 3,000 residents, most of them the descendants of Filipino, Japanese, and Portuguese workers who had been recruited to harvest pineapple, as his children. The paternalism of the plantation had survived the plantation. In 2012, Murdoch sold 98% of Lanai to Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle Corporation, for $300 million. The purchase included the 2 Four Seasons resorts, most of the island's housing, the grocery store, the gas station, the community newspaper, and nearly 90,000 acres of land. Ellison became landlord, employer, and utility provider to a population whose grandparents had arrived as imported labor. One man owned the island. The structure that James Dole had built in 1922, in which a single corporate entity controlled every significant aspect of life on Lanai, had not ended. It had changed hands. The workers had won the strike. The plantations had closed, the Big Five had dissolved or transformed into real estate companies, banks, and holding firms. But the land question, the question that had begun with the Great Mahele of 1848, had never been resolved. The acres that the missionaries had acquired, the crown lands that the Republic had seized, the government lands that the joint resolution had transferred, remained in dispute, and the people whose kingdom had been taken were still asking for it back. In 1993, 100 years after the overthrow, the Congress of the United States passed Public Law 103150, known as the Apology Resolution. The language was unambiguous. Congress acknowledged that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii occurred with the active participation of agents and citizens of the United States, and that the native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished to the United States their claims to their inherent sovereignty as a people. President Clinton signed the resolution into law on the 23rd of November, 1993. No land was returned, no sovereignty was restored, no reparations were paid. The apology was, in the end, a sentence. The solemn sovereignty movement that had been building since the 1970s continued to fracture over the question of what restoration would mean. Some organizations sought full independence. Others pursued a nation-within-a-nation model similar to the legal status of Native American tribes. Others still pressed for the return of the Crown and government lands, the approximately 1.8 million acres that had been transferred to the United States in 1898 and then to the state of Hawaii at statehood in 1959. No consensus has been reached. The land remains in state and federal hands. The Hawaiian Homes Commission, established in 1921, to return a portion of the land to native Hawaiians, maintains a waiting list that has exceeded 28,000 applicants. Some families have been on the list for decades. Then Lahaina burned. On the 8th of August, 2023, wind-driven wildfires swept through the town of Lahaina on the western coast of Maui, killing more than 100 people and destroying the historic center of what had been the original capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Before the ruins had cooled, reports emerged of developers and speculators making unsolicited offers to buy land from displaced residents. Governor Josh Green imposed an emergency moratorium on land transactions. Native Hawaiian scholars gave the pattern a name that connected it to everything that had come before. They called it plantation disaster capitalism. The fear was not abstract. It was genealogical. The same sequence, crisis followed by land transfer followed by displacement, had been repeating since 1848. The 2020 census had already documented the demographic conclusion of that sequence. For the first time in recorded history, more native Hawaiians lived on the American mainland than in the Hawaiian Islands. The people who had been a majority in their own kingdom, who had signed 21,000 petitions against annexation, who had watched their queen confined in her own palace, had become a minority not only in their homeland, but in the broader question of where they lived at all. What remains of the Big Five is institutional, not personal. First Hawaiian Bank and Bank of Hawaii descend from institutions established in the plantation era. Alexander and Baldwin, the firm founded by two sons of medical missionaries in 1870, is now a real estate investment trust that manages commercial properties across the islands. The irrigation infrastructure that the sugar planters built to divert mountain streams to the cane fields now carries water to golf courses, hotel grounds, and residential developments. The ditches are the same. The water rights are the same. The ownership is different only in name. The Dole plantation in Wahiawa, on the island of Oahu, is the second most visited tourist attraction in the state. More than 1 million people walk through its pineapple garden maze each year, buy Dole-branded merchandise in the gift shop, and take photographs beside a wooden sign bearing the name of the family that helped overthrow a queen. The sign does not mention the overthrow. The gift shop does not sell the queen's memoir. The connection between the pineapple label and the events of the 17th of January, 1893, is not part of the tour. The coup petitions sat in their box at the National Archives in Washington for almost exactly 1 century. In 1998, a scholar named Noenoe Silva traveled to Washington, opened the box, and brought copies of the petitions home to Hawaii. She found the signature of her own great-great-great-grandmother on one of the pages. 21,269 names written in ink that had not faded, by hands that had not been forgotten, carried by horseback and canoe across every island in the chain. They had been waiting in a box, in a building, in a city 3,000 miles from the kingdom they had tried to save. The empire of acres continues. If the story told here is one worth hearing, others are waiting on this channel. Like and subscribe to get notified about more stories. The next one is already being written.